I'm happy to be here. Some preliminary thoughts. I'm very respectful of all of you and your intentions and associations, respectful of the IATP work that's been done. I'm happy that a piece of my 40-year career on the faculty at the University of Minnesota was an engagement piece with IATP. My assets, if that's the right word, or my benefit to working with IATP is still evident today in terms of sometimes I run into people who participated in those rural climate dialogues, and Ann has already described the communities to you. I've done a lot of work in that context in other settings as well. We have, for example, in University of Minnesota Extension, we have the Rural Sustainable Development Program that works with a lot of communities on similar themes to try to stay engaged on topics that are difficult given the political stratification we have. You know, in Minnesota, in simple terms, it's metro versus rural. You know, there's also some gender, there's also some age, there's also some vocation, there's a variety of things that kind of tend to stratify us. And then when we talk about issues, it becomes a little bit difficult. I'm a great believer, though, in the common things we have. What's common for all of us, our values. I think when we get in meaningful dialogues about issues, we find that we have a lot more in common if we're willing to have the conversations. And I'm also not a social scientist, though, so I like to share facts. I've been one of the caretakers of the Minnesota State Climate Database since I've been here. I came in the 70s from NASA at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Although my ancestry goes back to 1854 here. In fact, my great-great-grandfather, those of you that have read one of my almanacs know, was one of the founders of this state. He served in the territorial legislature from 1854 to 1858, and then the first Minnesota legislature from 1858 to 1862. And in the winter, a terrible, terrible, terrible winter of the 19th century, 1856, 1857, where we had 3 consecutive months here in what was the Twin Cities landscape at that time, with minus 30-degree temperatures. The subcommittee from the territorial legislature wrote the first draft of the Minnesota State Constitution, because we were trying to attain statehood on the floors of Congress back in those days. And they must have been some super hardy people. So I've got a lot of respect for them, and also for those in Greater Minnesota that try to make their living off the land. A lot of respect and they want to be. The other thing to appreciate, I think, about them is they want to be good stewards. They want to do the right thing. We've got a lot of individual thinking. Anna alluded to that too. We do have sections of the state that are populated by the real strong-willed individual. You know, it's my way or the highway. You know, or whatever. We got communities like that scattered across the state. But a lot of our farm communities around the state, there's a real strong bond of community. There's a real culture built around that, and helping neighbors and doing things together, having an appreciation for their history, what their history has meant. And sometimes you can get in a meaningful conversation that resonates about climate change by talking about, you know, what did Grandma and Grandpa have to put up with? How did they succeed given the conditions of 1910, for example, or 1936, or 1888, or whatever. And then the data themselves. You've probably, those of you that have heard me on the radio or television over the years, one thing, and this is a natural thing, this isn't unique to me, but when you devote your career to science, in many areas you're working with data on a daily basis. And when you get data that are increasingly outside the historical population, you know, that we call them, for lack of things, in the medical profession, outliers or whatever, you get, and you're looking, and year by year, decade by decade, all of a sudden, this population of outliers is just flying off the page at you, screaming at you, then you know something's going on. And for me, that year was about, in Minnesota, that was about 1991 or so. I got through the 70s, got through the 80s. Minnesota's climate was so variable and continues to this day. We are all known worldwide as a group of American citizens that live in a climate that's really challenging. We have to be really resilient. I mean, people know this in Europe and Asia. People know this in the southern hemisphere, in Australia and New Zealand, if you say you're from Minnesota. And that's not myth, that's reality. So that if you look at the data, you see the historical data, you see this tremendous amount of variability, tremendous amount of historical variability. So to dissect some specific statistical and meaningful trends from all that variability really takes a lot of time. But that started to hit me and several at the University of Minnesota that are in atmospheric and climate science. That started to hit us in the early 90s because suddenly we could see, no, this isn't in the historical population. We're seeing things that are just, and it's just that pace of change, which I think is a fundamental message that I always try to get across, because people always want to tell you, the poo-pooers always want to tell you, well, Minnesota 10,000 years ago, or Minnesota 2 million years ago, or, whatever. Well, yes, Minnesota's landscape has been all over the place. I mean, this latitude we're in right now was not the latitude of Minnesota, 50 million years ago, or whatever. And the way the sun's energy strikes the landscape and everything, I mean, that's changed over time. So we've been all over the place. But I keep saying the message is we have about 150 plus years of actual measurements all over the state. We have 252 climate histories in the state of Minnesota. And if you dissect those data and you see how fast things are changing year by year, decade by decade, you can't find a period where things were changing that fast. Things change more remarkably, but over periods of thousands or millions of years, but not at the pace of change we're seeing today. And at that pace of change, you can then dovetail back to, you're not farming in the same environment that your mom and dad did, or your grandma, and they didn't have to cope with what you're coping with. And here's, the best thing we know how to handle it. We need to give attention to this because they all intentionally want to be good stewards. They not only look at the bottom line, but they want to be good stewards, and they want to be known. Most of them want to be known for that. So that's an important point to make as you dissect all this data and you convince people, yes, the world has changed. You're making decisions. You're doing things operationally that are different. They have to be different than what your parents or your grandparents or your great-grandparents did. And then also we can talk about, transpose that past perspective and look at the future. Most people care about what their kids are going to grow up in, or their grandkids. And so to preserve Minnesota and the quality of life in Minnesota, both from its natural resources, those we've enjoyed in our life, and its infrastructure, those aspects of our infrastructure that have given us our good quality of life, for the next generation, we better be paying attention, because those aren't going to, they're going to be operating in a different environment. And so the adaptation piece has been one I've been very dedicated to since we formed the statewide Climate Adaptation Partnership Committee back in 2007. And we've had annual meetings. We have one coming up in November 14th of this year, statewide meetings. And it's not just academics and researchers talking about climate change means this, my data show this, you know, I'm going to do an experiment about this. It's not just an academic exchange. What I like about it is it's a practitioner's exchange. We get people from all over the state come in and share their experiences. It's about sharing experiential knowledge. What have you done in your watershed district, your public works department, storm sewer management, wastewater management? What have you done with your architecture and energy design? What have you done with your public health? What have you done with your transportation system that has worked or not worked relative to climate adaptation? Tell us those stories. Tell us what worked and tell us what doesn't. And we're not the only state doing that. There's many, many other states that are doing that and sharing the experiential knowledge that we need to share. And building that from the ground up, which I love, is what Anna's so dedicated to in IATP. Building that community by community may, in the long run, be the way we get there. It may, in the long run, be the way we get there. You know, because our top-down leadership on some of this stuff is just so lacking. Until maybe we'll wake up one day, maybe the younger generation will wake up one day and decide that maybe our lawmakers, the bodies that compose our lawmakers, need to have a few scientifically literate people in these positions. So
when are you running?
No, I'm too old. My day is come and gone. But I'm still, to the day I die, I'm still going to be educating about the facts. First and foremost, as an educator, I think you're obligated to educate about the facts, about what knowledge we've gained and the applications where that knowledge could be applied, and then in turn try to be an advocate for the deployment of that knowledge. I'll be doing that till the day I die. I think that's just a dedication, and I'm not the only one. There's many, many other people in my profession that have retired in the last year or two that are still very active in doing things like that. And so it's, you know, it's something we're all in the mix. None of us is excluded. There isn't anybody in this room excluded from this issue and what's going to happen. And from the standpoint of having a voice in how we're going to deal with it, both from an adaptation and a mitigation standpoint, we all need to keep our voices active, and we all should be, even though I know it's hard, and I hope we have a younger generation coming up that's a little more assertive than I've been, but we need to stay engaged, even when we know it's going to be hard. Even though when we know we might be called names or we might be poo-pooed or whatever, or we might make an enemy out of somebody that's been a friend most of our life. But we got to stay engaged on this because it's so important. It absolutely is. One of the things I'm most proud of in my career is kind of a thing that's hidden under the covers. I taught school science teachers at the U in a special class for 22 years. And my atmospheric and climate science curriculum is now in over 200 school districts around the region. And I'm very proud of that because that curriculum is the real stuff. It's based on real data, okay? And so that's what's being taught to Johnny and Sally in 4th and 5th and 6th grade now. And I think over time, that kind of thing is going to be meaningful. So I'm really happy that I was able to work with so many hundreds and hundreds of school science teachers over the years. And not that undergraduate and graduate students aren't important in other venues, but school science teachers really carry a lot of power when you think about educating our next generation scientifically. Mm-hmm. And so that's, I think, that's about, the only other thing I can tell you is at the national meetings, it's been pointed out by some rather famous people, Jim Hansen, the NASA climatologist, Ben Santer, the Lawrence Livermore climatologist, Kevin Trenberth, the NOAA climatologist, that I'm the only climatologist in this nation that's won a Career Achievement Award from U.S. Agriculture. They don't normally award climatologists anything. But to this day, I'm hoping the day comes when somebody else can join me that gets an award from American Agriculture for doing some good work for them. But it might be a while. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, those are thanks for staying. And again, even in retirement, Anna knows this. If I can keep having a hand and a helping hand in some way, I'm still, as long as I'm able, I'm still willing to do things like that. And we'll hope November's coming around, and we'll hope for the best.
That would be November 7th.
Yeah, we'll hope for the best and see how it goes. But if you're interested in IATP, which I assume you are, and you're interested in some of this work, please go online and look at the statewide climate adaptation meeting is coming up November 14th. It's on the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus, and I think there's still open registration for it. But if you want to hear some real practical reports, on the different sectors of Minnesota's culture and what's being tried and what's being worked on from some real practitioners, that's a thing you might want to pay attention to as well. And that's going to go on. I think it's well enough ingrained now after the number of years that's going to be on the Minnesota calendar every year now as we go into the future. So, yeah.
Is there a discipline? Oh, I guess we're out of time.
No, I just wanted to applaud.
Yeah. Is there a discipline not represented in this wonderful group of practitioners that you feel would be particularly important to try and get represented at this adaptation committee?
Yeah, we've wrestled with that for a decade now. It's a very good question. We've tried to integrate as many different disciplines as we can. I'm trying to think if there's some there is one area that I'm aware of that's emerging from our food science and nutrition department, and that's food safety.
Oh, yeah.
Because climate change has some real implications for food safety. And with the transportation and storage and the whole gamut. And we haven't yet had a major discussion at the statewide conference on that particular topic. But I think we've already got people kind of advocating for that. It's still not on the agenda for this year, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's on the agenda for next year. But we've covered quite a few of the major ones over time. The Mayo Clinic now has a 21 physician team that's looking at climate change and public health. And so we're going to be hearing a lot more from the Mayo Clinic on that. And then the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, has a climate change division that's looking at how to cope with and still manage energy efficiencies and also cope with these extreme events that we get. Because it's really the extremes that are so dramatically impacting our infrastructure. We can show you the measures of central tendencies, like all the means and everything. We can show you those. But the populations of extremes is what's really frightening, because the impact of those is powerful. And we're starting to live through many of those already in the state of Minnesota. Yeah.
I might mention both Minneapolis and St. Paul have offices of resiliency. Unfortunately, the two cities have taken very different paths. St. Paul has a top-notch director who used to be on the city council. They are self-funding it out of the city budget, and their mission is to help the residents of St. Paul endure and recover from disasters, be they natural or man-made. Unfortunately, Minneapolis has taken a very different path. We got $3 million from the Rockefeller Foundation to fund this office, and we had a great director, Kate Knuth.
Oh, yeah.
Unfortunately, had a dust-up with the mayor, and she resigned. And as far as I know, no new director has been replaced, and that funding is now going into affordable housing. And we need to really have something here in Minneapolis to deal with, because we're gonna get a whole lot more population and we're
Right.
building like crazy in my neighborhood along the riverfront.
Oh, yeah.
So if any of you have a direct line to your city council member, please
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
nudge them along to get this office up and running again in the way it should be.
And this is all, this is in the last half year or so? Or?
Since Mayor Fry was inaugurated.
Oh, okay. Oh, boy.
So that would
Okay.
be about the last year.
Yeah, okay.
But then there's the Minneapolis 2040 plan, which is still being revised, but,
Yeah,
yeah, so talk to your council member, please.
okay, good.
I want to try to keep us moving along a little bit, but you had a question back there.
It was really specific, so I'll maybe talk to Dr. Seeley afterwards.
Okay.
Did you have one more?
Well, under whose auspices is this adaptation committee? Is it a state thing or?
Governor Pawlenty, to his credit, during his term as governor, created statewide climate partnerships, ad hoc. I mean, this wasn't, you're not gonna find a stack of documents, for climate mitigation strategy in the state and climate adaptation in the state. The University of Minnesota Extension, since it's dedicated to community outreach in all 87 counties, we took on the adaptation piece wholeheartedly. And we've been involved in that ever since. The Institute for the Environment at the University of Minnesota, back then I think under Dr. John Foley, if you know that name, I think they took on the they became one of the pieces in the mitigation committee. I don't know why we don't get together, between the two and talk more commonly. I think part of it is just a workload thing. You get so overwhelmed because we've got partners like, in the adaptation piece, we've got partners like the Science Museum of Minnesota. We've got many watershed districts. We've got the Mayo Clinic. We've got, trying to think who else. We've got some of the state agencies like the DNR, Department of Health, Department of Commerce, who am I forgetting? Department of Agriculture. So we've got a broad representation. We even have some NGOs on there. I think we've had Fresh Energy and, now I'm gonna,
Freshwater Institute.
Freshwater Institute and Fresh Energy, and I'm forgetting one other one, darn it. Anyway, and just staying and keeping the communication channels open and trying to keep everything flowing in the one arena has been more than enough for us, but we probably over time, I could see those two groups, getting together a little bit more. And it's, the nice thing is the financing, the ongoing, or the kind of the clearinghouse for the financing of our work has finally taken root permanently at the University of Minnesota. So it's going to handle, for at least the ongoing purposes of the Climate Adaptation Committee in the state, it's going to handle all that and keep going. And we've had some major contributions from corporate Minnesota, which is really nice too, because corporate Minnesota is quite concerned about this. So,
Can you give us an example of a corporation?
yeah, let's see, General Mills.
Okay.
Yeah, Ken Powell, the former CEO, was a real advocate. His vice president, Jerry Lynch, served on, in fact, two of our planning committees. A real powerful force behind advocating for adaptation. And we had, I'm terrible remembered, Cargill, and we had 3M.
Yeah.
And now I'm losing his name. Who's the CEO of 3M? He's Thulin. Thulin. We had, yeah. So, and then we've had Thomson Reuters of all people, out in Egan. And so there's some good there's some good ongoing backing there. And despite this waxing and waning on the political scene, that's why I'm so happy to see we don't have a problem drawing people together to talk about their work. We don't have people out there really doing the work for their community. They love to talk about it, and we don't have problems getting people to come, you know, and talk about what they're doing and advocate for what they're doing, and also share their horror stories. I mean, you know, there's some things out there that didn't work, but I mean, you got to keep going, and so it's good. The Winona, Morris, and Grand Rapids meetings, you could see. I don't know if Anna talked about this, but the transformation that took place from start to finish, you could kind of sense and see people. You know how you can read people's attitudes and their enthusiasm, and all of a sudden it's like a light bulb went on in their head, you know, and oh my God, you know, I didn't realize that, or whatever. And that's really encouraging to see that happen, especially with the older people like me that have kind of been stuck in their ways for decades and decades. But so it's great to have that affiliation, and I think I think it'll. Did you say this upstairs? Do you think that jury approach, you know, with what you've done on the time, is that, you think that's going to we're going to start to see that duplicated in other?
Yeah, I mean, I've had the privilege of being on a fellowship to explore that, deepening and exploring.
Yeah.
And I may mention to some of you, there's an interest from all different angles. Government, how do we put this within our government system? Even here, the Environmental Quality Board, if some of you are familiar with that. Over a year and a half ago, took this as a precedent for how we get public input ahead of issues like water quality issues and especially contentious issues, and they are bringing that conversation back in a couple of months, specifically with this model and a few other civic engagement models. So I'm very hopeful related to that, and I think it's the ability for people to, you know, a lot of times people will say, 18 people, 3 intensive days, you know, how can you have the impact we need to have fast enough, quick enough? But what Dr. Seeley alluded to, of when people truly have transformational change on this and they're motivated to do something and they become leaders in their community that aren't your typical leaders on climate change. You know, we had our first dialogue almost 5 years ago, and there is movement and action still, you know, picking up pace and speed, and so that's where I find hope. If you invest quality from the get-go, you get this ripple effect.
Have you involved the farmers union on that?
We have worked with we work with them closely, like the listening sessions, but they haven't been, you know, in one of our, they were one of our expert testimony in one of our communities on some of that information.
I've worked with Kevin Papp, the president of Minnesota Farm Bureau. I haven't worked with officials in the Minnesota Farmers Union, but I've worked a lot with Kevin over the years. And then we also, climate change and agriculture is an embedded theme in the University of Minnesota's, it's called the MARL program, the Minnesota Agricultural and Rural Leadership Program, which trains leaders in various aspects of agriculture, and that's been ongoing now for quite a few years. So a lot of people that are business leaders in agriculture now have gone through the MARL program over the years. So that's another amplification of this thing that Anna's talking about. So.